The morning of December 3rd, 1941, a warehouse in occupied Paris. A German soldier on routine inspection duty lifted a wooden crate marked for medical supplies. Something felt wrong. The weight distribution was off. Inside, beneath layers of cotton padding, he found them. 100 dead rats, each one meticulously sewn shut, each one packed with enough plastic explosive to rupture a steam boiler. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The discovery triggered something unprecedented in Wehrmacht security protocols. Within hours, photographs of these creatures circulated to every military installation across occupied Europe. Training lectures were hastily organized. Security officers examined coal piles with new paranoia. The rats never exploded. They never needed to. The British Special Operations Executive had achieved something far more valuable than sabotage. They had weaponized uncertainty itself. This is the documented story of how dead rats became one of the most successful psychological operations of World War II, not through what they destroyed, but through what they made the Germans fear. By 1941, Britain stood alone. France had fallen. The Soviet Union reeled from Operation Barbarossa. German U-boats controlled the Atlantic shipping lanes. The Luftwaffe had bombed London for 57 consecutive nights. Conventional military resistance seemed impossible. Britain needed new methods, irregular methods, methods that could strike not at German strength, but at German sanity. Winston Churchill's directive was simple: set Europe ablaze. On July 22, 1940, the Special Operations Executive came into existence with a mandate that would have seemed absurd in any previous conflict. Train civilians to kill, teach housewives to sabotage, transform ordinary people into weapons. The SOE's first headquarters occupied 64 Baker Street in London. The address was no accident. The street where Arthur Conan Doyle had placed his fictional detective now housed men and women whose real work exceeded any crime fiction. Among them, scientists and engineers assembled at various research stations scattered across the British countryside, each site designated only by number: Station 9 at the Frythe, near Welwyn Garden City; Station 12 at Aston House near Stevenage; Station 15 at the Thatched Barn near Borehamwood. These stations developed the tools of irregular warfare: radio transmitters disguised as suitcases, explosive charges moulded to look like coal, time delay fuses that could be activated hours before an agent left the scene. The men behind these devices worked under conditions of absolute secrecy. Section 15, devoted to camouflage and concealment, was led by practical men drawn from civilian industry. Among them, Charles Fraser Smith, a former missionary who had bounced through various occupations: school teacher, motorcycle messenger, aircraft factory worker. The Ministry of Supply listed him as a clerk in the clothing and textile department. His actual work involved designing tools that would keep agents alive behind enemy lines. Fraser Smith's inventions read like equipment for a spy novel that wouldn't be written for another decade. Miniature cameras hidden inside cigarette lighters, maps printed on silk scarves that could be burned line by line to prevent capture, steel shoelaces that functioned as garrotes, fountain pens containing hidden compass needles. Each device solved a specific problem faced by agents operating in occupied territory: how to photograph documents without bulky equipment, how to navigate without suspicious maps, how to kill silently when necessary. But in late 1941, Section 15 faced a different challenge: how to sabotage German industry without requiring agents to access the machinery directly. The problem was straightforward. German factories, power stations, and locomotive facilities operated around the clock. Getting an agent inside was difficult. Getting an agent close enough to plant explosives on critical equipment was nearly impossible. Guards patrolled, workers watched. Any suspicious behavior triggered immediate investigation. What Section 15 needed was a delivery system, something that could carry explosives into a facility without raising suspicion. something so ordinary that no one would question its presence, something that would be disposed of in exactly the way needed to trigger maximum damage. Someone suggested rats. The logic was perfect. Factories had coal piles. Coal piles attracted rats. Workers hated rats. When a stoker found a dead rat in the coal, his immediate instinct would be to shovel it into the furnace. No investigation, no second thought. Just a natural human response to an unpleasant discovery. The rat would enter the furnace. The heat would detonate the explosive. The explosion would rupture the boiler's pressure vessel. The resulting steam explosion would destroy the facility, all from something as mundane as disposing of vermin. The procurement process began with a phone call. An SOE officer, posing as a university student, contacted a London supplier of laboratory animals. He needed approximately 100 rats for medical experiments. The supplier, unaware that his creatures were destined for anything beyond dissection, provided dead specimens as requested. These rats, already deceased, arrived at Section 15's facility, where they faced a transformation more macabre than any medical procedure. The technical challenge was considerable. A rat carcass offers limited internal volume. The explosive charge had to be powerful enough to breach a pressurized boiler, but small enough to fit inside the animal's body cavity. The solution came from Nobel Chemicals Limited. Their explosive number 808, commonly called Nobel 808, had been developed well before the war. It possessed properties ideal for this. Application. Nobel 808 appeared as green material resembling children's modeling clay. It smelled faintly of almonds, a characteristic of certain explosive compounds. More importantly, it was plastic, moldable, stable. It could be shaped to fit irregular spaces and would not detonate from shock or friction. Only heat or a detonator would trigger it. The fabrication process required precision taxidermy skills. Each rat was skinned carefully, preserving the external appearance. The skin was then sewn back together around a core of Nobel 808. A number 6 primer was embedded in the explosive. This primer connected to a short length of safety fuse. At the end of the fuse, a number 27 detonator was crimped in place. A copper tube igniter completed the assembly. The result looked exactly like a dead rat, slightly stiff perhaps, but nothing that would trigger immediate suspicion in a dimly lit coal pile. The operational concept was elegant in its simplicity. SOE agents or French resistance members would place these rats in German facilities. Near boilers, among coal supplies, in locomotive, coal tenders, the rats would lie there, seemingly unremarkable, until discovered. The stoker or worker, seeing a dead rat, would react with disgust. The shovel would come out. The rat would be thrown into the flames. The furnace heat would ignite the safety fuse. The fuse would burn through to the detonator. The detonator would trigger the Nobel 808. The explosive would create a penetration in the boiler. The pressurized steam, suddenly released through a small breach, would cause catastrophic boiler failure. The facility would be destroyed. The worker would be dead. Future workers would have no warning because the evidence would be vaporized. But there was a secondary mechanism. Some rats were fitted with time delay fuses instead of heat-activated ones. These used a device SOE designated as the number 10 delay switch. Officially listed as switch number 10 delay, this mechanism represented elegant simplicity. A brass tube, later manufactured in aluminum to save metal, contained a glass vial of cupric chloride. Below the vial, a spring-loaded striker sat under tension. A thin metal wire held the striker in place. To activate the device, the operator crushed the copper section of the tube. This broke the glass vial. The cupric chloride, an acidic compound, began eating through the restraining wire. When the wire dissolved completely, the spring released. The striker shot down the tube and hit a percussion cap. The percussion cap detonated. This ignited the main charge. The delay time depended on the cupric chloride concentration. Higher concentration meant faster corrosion. Lower concentration meant longer delays. The number 10 switches came in various time ranges, 10 minutes to 24 hours, color-coded for quick identification. But they were not precise instruments. Temperature and humidity affected the corrosion rate. A switch set for 1 hour might detonate as early as 57 minutes or as late as 63 minutes. At longer delays, the imprecision increased. A 12-hour fuse might activate anywhere between 11 and 13 hours. For sabotage operations, where the agent needed to be far away before detonation, this imprecision was acceptable. For operations requiring exact timing, other methods were used. The explosive rats represented a convergence of chemistry, psychology, and operational security. The chemistry was straightforward. Nobel 808 was stable enough for field handling but powerful enough for the mission. The psychology was perfect. Humans have an instinctive revulsion to dead animals. The immediate response is disposal. The method of disposal in a factory setting with boilers is incineration. The operational security was absolute. If an agent was searched and found carrying empty rat skins, they appeared to be nothing more than curious specimens. Unpleasant, perhaps, but not incriminating. Even if the rat was discovered before disposal, it looked like an ordinary dead rat. Unless someone decided to dissect it, the explosive would remain undetected. By early 1942, 100 explosive rats were ready for deployment. They were packaged carefully. Each rat was wrapped individually. The entire shipment was placed in a container marked for occupied France. The distribution plan called for French resistance networks to receive them. The resistance would place them strategically across German-occupied industrial sites, factories in the Ruhr, power stations in Belgium, railway facilities throughout France. The plan anticipated dozens of boiler explosions. Each explosion would disrupt German war production. Each disruption would slow the German military machine. Each delay would give the Allies more time to prepare their eventual offensive. The container shipped from Britain across the Channel. It moved through the resistance network's supply chains. It travelled toward its final destination in occupied France. And then something happened that would transform this operation from a technical success into a psychological triumph. The Germans found it. The interception remains undocumented in specific detail. German records from 1942 are incomplete, many destroyed in the final days of the war. What is certain is that sometime in early 1942, German security forces seized the container, whether through routine inspection, informant intelligence, or pure chance. The shipment never reached its intended recipients. 100 explosive rats fell into enemy hands before a single one could be deployed operationally. The German response revealed something unexpected about military bureaucracy and threat assessment. A different army might have quietly disposed of the rats and intensified general security measures. The Wehrmacht did something far more thorough. They treated the discovery as a major intelligence breakthrough requiring systematic analysis and wide distribution of information. Photographs were taken of each specimen. Technical drawings were produced showing the internal construction. Detailed reports described the placement of explosives, the detonation mechanisms, and the probable method of deployment. These materials were compiled into briefing documents. The documents were distributed to military schools throughout the Third Reich, not just to intelligence services or security units, but to ordinary military training facilities. Officers studying logistics saw them. Engineers training in industrial security examined them. Even combat units received briefings on the explosive rats as part of general threat awareness. The rats themselves became teaching aids. Several specimens were preserved and placed on display at military academies. Students could examine the actual devices. They could see how the skin concealed the explosive. They could understand the simplicity and effectiveness of the design. The displays travelled between installations, each venue adding to the number of personnel who now knew that the British were using weaponized rodent carcasses for sabotage operations. This educational campaign created exactly what the SOE could never have achieved through actual deployments. Fear, uncertainty, Constant vigilance directed at threats that did not exist. Every German facility with a boiler now had a new security protocol. Coal piles had to be inspected before use. Workers were instructed to watch for dead rats. Any deceased rodent found near fuel supplies was to be reported immediately to security personnel. The rat would then be examined carefully before disposal. If it seemed suspicious, if the body felt too stiff, if the weight distribution seemed wrong, explosive ordnance specialists would be called. The manpower cost was staggering. Consider the mathematics of industrial-scale paranoia. Germany controlled territories from the Atlantic coast to deep inside the Soviet Union. Within this territory, thousands of factories operated. Hundreds of power stations generated electricity. Locomotive facilities serviced trains across the occupied zones. Each installation now required personnel to inspect coal supplies for explosive rats. Each inspection took time. Each suspicious rat required expert examination. Each expert examination pulled trained personnel away from productive work. The SOE files, declassified decades later, contain a remarkable assessment. The documents acknowledge that the explosive rats never successfully detonated. Not one boiler was destroyed by a rat bomb. Not one German worker was killed by a rodent-delivered explosive, yet the operation was classified as a major success. The exact wording preserved in British archives reads, "The trouble caused to them was a much greater success to us than if the rats had actually been used." This conclusion reflected a sophisticated understanding of irregular warfare. The objective was not simply to destroy German infrastructure. The objective was to degrade German operational efficiency through any available means. An explosion destroys one boiler and can be repaired. Fear of explosions disrupts thousands of facilities indefinitely and creates a permanent drag on industrial output. Every hour spent inspecting coal piles was an hour not spent producing war materials. Every false alarm was a disruption to carefully planned production schedules. Every security briefing was time diverted from actual military training. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate security measures. German personnel now worked with a new awareness that seemingly ordinary objects might be weapons. The British had demonstrated that they would weaponize anything. Rats today, what tomorrow? This uncertainty bred a culture of suspicion that complicated every aspect of occupation duty. A dead animal near supplies was now a potential threat. Anything unfamiliar required investigation. The cognitive load of constant vigilance, even for unlikely threats, eroded efficiency in ways difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The irony was perfect. The SOE had invested minimal resources in the explosive rat program. 100 dead rats from a London supplier. Several days of fabrication work. A single shipment lost to enemy interception. Total cost in time and materials was negligible compared to conventional sabotage operations. Yet the return on investment exceeded anything achievable through actual deployments. The rats worked better as a captured threat than they ever could have as a deployed weapon. The explosive rat story illuminated a larger truth about the special operations executive's approach to irregular warfare. Churchill's mandate to set Europe ablaze was not merely about physical destruction. It was about creating conditions that made occupation more difficult, more expensive, and more demoralizing for the enemy. Every German soldier watching for explosive rats was a soldier not focused on his primary mission. Every industrial manager implementing new security protocols was a manager diverted from production optimization. Every technical expert examining suspicious rodents was an expert unavailable for genuine threats. Section 15 continued developing similar devices throughout the war. Explosive coal became a signature product. These were hollow lumps of cast plaster, painted and textured to resemble actual coal, filled with plastic explosive and fitted with time delay fuses. The concept mirrored the rat bombs. Workers would shovel the fake coal into furnaces alongside real coal. The heat would eventually detonate the charge. Boiler explosion would follow. The explosive coal shared the rat's essential characteristic. It exploited existing human behaviors rather than requiring agents to perform. Suspicious actions. Other section. 15 creations followed similar logic. Tire bursters disguised as animal droppings. Horse droppings on European roads. Camel droppings in North Africa. Painted plaster shapes that vehicles would drive over, puncturing tires on hidden spikes. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Hand grenades concealed in Balinese wood carvings, sold to Japanese troops as souvenirs. Wine bottles made of thick celluloid, shaped to hold explosives in both the base and neck sections, with enough actual wine in the neck to pass casual inspection. Each device targeted a specific vulnerability in enemy operations. Each required minimal agent action. Each created disproportionate disruption relative to its cost and complexity. Fraser Smith's work extended far beyond explosive devices. His most lasting contributions involved escape and evasion equipment for prisoners of war, compasses hidden in uniform buttons, maps printed on silk, easily concealed, impossible to rustle when unfolded, saws embedded in hairbrush backs, playing cards that could be separated to reveal map sections. These items saved lives. British POWs using Fraser Smith's equipment successfully escaped from German camps throughout the war. Some of these escapes provided crucial intelligence. Others forced Germans to divert troops to recapture fugitives. All of them demonstrated that British ingenuity extended even into captivity. The explosive rats represented only one small chapter in Section 15's war against German logistics and morale. Yet they embodied the essential philosophy that guided SOE operations from 1940 until 1945. Psychological impact matters as much as physical destruction. Uncertainty is a weapon. Fear multiplies the cost of every defensive measure. And sometimes the best sabotage is convincing the enemy that sabotage is everywhere, even when it exists nowhere. The broader implications of the rat operation influenced Allied irregular warfare strategy throughout the conflict. The success validated investing resources in operations that might never produce direct combat results, but would degrade enemy effectiveness through indirect means. OSS, the American equivalent of SOE, adopted similar approaches in their operations. The coordination between British and American irregular warfare units created a systematic campaign to make occupation as difficult as possible for Axis forces. Every occupied country presented opportunities for this kind of asymmetric warfare. German responses to the rat threat revealed vulnerabilities in their security apparatus. The decision to widely disseminate information about the rats showed that Wehrmacht command valued education over operational security. They wanted their personnel informed about threats, even if that information created anxiety and consumed resources. This approach contrasted with Soviet security doctrine, which often kept soldiers ignorant of specific threats to prevent panic. Neither approach was definitively superior. The German method created better prepared personnel, but at the cost of reduced morale. The Soviet method maintained morale, but left personnel vulnerable to unfamiliar threats. The rats also demonstrated limits of intelligence work. German security services successfully interdicted one shipment. But they could never be certain it was the only shipment. Perhaps the British had sent multiple containers. Perhaps some rats had already been distributed before the interception. Perhaps new shipments were constantly arriving through channels that remained undetected. This uncertainty was the weapon. The Germans could not know the full scope of the threat. They could only assume the worst and act accordingly. Every assumption in favor of caution was an investment in defending against a threat that, unknown to them, had already been entirely neutralized. The human cost of these operations rarely appears in official histories. The German workers, who now spent their shifts watching for explosive rats, experienced genuine stress. Factory conditions in wartime were already difficult. Long hours, dangerous equipment, insufficient food. Adding fear of sabotaged coal piles made unbearable conditions worse. Some workers undoubtedly died in industrial accidents caused by distraction or by excessive caution that led to procedural mistakes. These deaths cannot be attributed directly to the rats, but they stemmed from the same campaign of psychological warfare that made the rats strategically valuable. French resistance networks, the intended recipients of the rat shipment, continued other forms of sabotage throughout the occupation. They received different tools from SOE. Time delay explosives, plastic charges molded to resemble innocuous objects, weapons dropped by parachute during nighttime operations. The loss of the explosive rats barely affected their overall capabilities. If anything, the German paranoia triggered by the rats made other forms of Detonated sabotage easier. Security personnel watching coal piles were not watching railways. Explosive ordnance experts examining suspicious rodents were not available to investigate actual demolition sites. The rats succeeded by failing, drawing attention and resources toward a threat that no longer existed while real operations continued elsewhere. The preservation of specimen rats in German military schools created an unexpected historical legacy. Some of these teaching aids survived the war. When Allied forces overran German military installations in 1945, they recovered SOE equipment that had been used for enemy training purposes. One explosive rat, captured from an SOE agent named Maurice Ledane who worked behind enemy lines, was confiscated by French police in 1942 and kept for training purposes. Decades later, in 2017, this specific rat sold at auction through Bonhams for $1,875. It had become a collector's item, a tangible artifact of a psychological operation that succeeded beyond its planner's intentions. The explosive rat program existed within a larger ecosystem of unconventional weapons that characterized special operations executive methodology. While the rats consumed German resources through captured specimens, other animal-based weapons progressed through various stages of development and deployment. The sheer creativity and occasional absurdity of these programs revealed the desperation and innovation that defined irregular warfare in the 1940s. The bat bomb represented American innovation in the same conceptual space. Lytle S. Adams, a Pennsylvania dentist, visited Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico and observed thousands of bats emerging at dusk. His proposal to the United States military suggested attaching tiny incendiary devices to bats, cooling them into hibernation, and dropping them over Japanese cities in containers that would open at altitude. The bats would awaken, seek shelter in buildings, and the timers would ignite fires throughout urban areas. The concept actually progressed to testing stages. Bats were fitted with napalm devices. Trial drops were conducted. One test famously went wrong when armed bats escaped and set fire to a military airfield in New Mexico. The program consumed substantial resources before cancellation, superseded by a more straightforward incendiary approach. The atomic bomb. Soviet anti-tank dogs represented the darkest application of animal weapons. Beginning in the 1930s, Soviet military researchers trained dogs to associate tanks with food. The dogs were starved, then fed exclusively under stationary tanks. Once the association was established, explosives were strapped to the dogs' backs with a vertical wooden lever. The concept held that starving dogs would run beneath German tanks seeking food. The lever would strike the tank's underside, and the explosive would detonate. Reality proved more complicated. In actual combat during 1941, the dogs panicked at the noise and movement of advancing tanks. Many fled back toward Soviet lines, forcing Soviet soldiers to shoot their own explosive-laden animals. Those that did run toward German tanks often targeted Soviet vehicles instead, having been trained on Soviet tank models that used diesel fuel. German tanks used gasoline, and the dogs, trained to follow the diesel scent, naturally ran toward familiar-smelling Soviet armor. The program failed spectacularly, demonstrating the limits of behavioral conditioning under combat conditions. These parallel programs highlighted what made the explosive rats unique. Unlike bats or dogs, the rats required no behavioral training. They were already dead. They demanded no feeding, no conditioning, no management of living creatures whose behavior might prove unpredictable. The rats were inert objects that exploited human behavior rather than animal instincts. A German stoker's response to finding a dead rat was consistent and predictable. A bat's behavior when subjected to temperature changes and aerial drops was not. A dog's reaction to battlefield chaos could not be reliably controlled. The rat's simplicity was their genius. Section 15's broader catalogue of devices demonstrated systematic thinking about sabotage methodology. The descriptive catalogue of special devices and supplies, produced by 1944, allowed SOE agents to select equipment like ordering from a specialized military supply company. The catalogue ran to multiple volumes. Each page detailed specific tools designed for specific missions. By 1944, Section 15 supplied 90,000 objects annually. This industrial-scale production of irregular warfare equipment represented a massive investment in capabilities that conventional military planning had barely acknowledged before the war. The catalogue's contents revealed the chaotic breadth of SOE operations. Clothing authentic to every occupied country, down to the correct buttons and stitching patterns used by local manufacturers. Documents forged so precisely that they included intentional errors consistent with legitimate papers from specific regions. Wireless transmitters, disguised as household objects, weapons concealed in everyday items, and always, explosives. Explosives shaped like coal, explosives molded into logs, explosives hidden in food tins, explosives everywhere, waiting for the right moment to destroy German infrastructure. Charles Fraser Smith's personal contribution extended into legend and literature. Ian Fleming, working for British naval intelligence during the war, certainly knew of SOE's gadget development programs. Whether he specifically knew Fraser Smith remains historically uncertain. But Fleming's creation of Q Branch and the character Q, the quartermaster who equipped James Bond with unlikely devices, bore unmistakable similarities to Fraser Smith's actual work. The cigarette lighter camera, the modified clothing, the weapons disguised as ordinary objects. These fictional elements had real counterparts in Fraser Smith's inventory. After the war, Fraser Smith himself encouraged the connection, writing books about his wartime work that positioned him as the real-life Q. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more impressive than fiction. Fraser Smith designed tools that kept real agents alive in situations far more dangerous than any novel could responsibly depict. The explosive rat's success as a psychological weapon influenced post-war thinking about irregular warfare and special operations. Military theorists studying the SOE's record recognized that the most cost-effective operations were often those that forced the enemy to expend resources, defending against threats that did not exist or could not be effectively countered. This insight shaped Cold War intelligence operations. The CIA's Technical Services Division, the actual Q branch of American intelligence, developed equipment following similar principles. Make the enemy uncertain. Make them defend everywhere. Make them exhaust resources on security measures that degrade operational effectiveness. The broader impact of SOE operations on German military effectiveness remains difficult to quantify precisely. German industrial production continued growing until mid-1944, despite years of SOE sabotage. Allied bombing campaigns caused far more direct damage than SOE operations ever achieved. Yet, the aggregate effect of thousands of small disruptions, the cumulative weight of constant vigilance, the steady erosion of efficiency through psychological pressure, these factors contributed to German logistics problems that worsened throughout the war. An hour lost inspecting coal here, a production delay from a false alarm there. Gradually, these inefficiencies accumulated into significant drags on German war-making capacity. The French resistance, working with SOE equipment and training, achieved more substantial direct results. Railway sabotage before and during the Normandy invasion significantly delayed German reinforcement movements. The German Seventh Army's deployment to counter the D-Day landings was slowed by countless small delays. Bridges destroyed, tracks demolished, locomotives disabled, communications severed. Many of these operations used SOE-supplied explosives and time-delay fuses. The resistance fighters conducting these missions had been trained by SOE instructors. Their equipment came from Section 15 and other SOE supply organizations. The explosive rats never participated in these operations, but the same logistics network that would have distributed them instead provided the resistance with tools that genuinely impacted German military capabilities. Station 9 at the Frythe, Station 12 at Aston House, Station 15 at the Thatched Barn. These facilities closed after the war. Their personnel dispersed into civilian life. Many never spoke about their wartime work, bound by Official Secrets Act obligations that lasted decades. Files remained classified until the 1970s and 80s. Even then, many documents were destroyed per standard protocols. What survived provided glimpses into an organization that had operated in shadows by necessity and remained in shadows by policy long after the war ended. The Natural History Museum in London played an unexpected role in SOE operations. During the war, portions of the museum were requisitioned for SOE training and equipment storage. The same building that housed dinosaur skeletons and mineral collections also contained explosives, weapons, and training materials for agents preparing to parachute into occupied Europe. The juxtaposition seemed surreal. Scientists cataloguing specimens in one wing, secret agents learning sabotage techniques in another. The museum suffered bomb damage during the Blitz, but continued functioning throughout the war. Both its public educational mission and its secret support role for irregular warfare. German countermeasures against SOE operations evolved throughout the conflict. The Gestapo and Abwehr developed increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting resistance networks and infiltrating agent networks. Many SOE agents were captured, some were executed, others died in concentration camps. The casualty rate for agents operating in occupied France was particularly severe. Approximately 15% of SOE personnel sent into the field were killed. For women agents, who often worked as couriers or radio operators, the danger was equally acute. Violette Sabo, Noor Inayat Khan, and many others died in German custody. Their courage enabled operations that saved countless other lives. The explosive rats represented the safest kind of sabotage, the kind that never happened. No agent risked capture delivering them. No resistance member died planting them. No German soldier was actually killed by them. Yet they achieved their purpose through the simple fact of German awareness. This paradox defined the operation's genius. Maximum effect, minimum risk, infinite return on a finite investment. By 1945, as Allied forces liberated occupied territories and pushed into Germany itself, the need for SOE's particular expertise diminished. Conventional military operations replaced irregular warfare as the primary method of fighting. SOE personnel transitioned to occupation duties or returned to civilian life. The organization officially disbanded in January 1946. Its functions were absorbed by other intelligence services. The Special Air Service continued some special operations roles. MI6 resumed peacetime intelligence work, but the specific combination of sabotage, subversion, and support for resistance movements that had defined SOE ceased to exist as an independent organization. The legacy persisted in unexpected ways. Military organizations worldwide studied SOE methods. The United States Army Special Forces, established in 1952, explicitly modeled aspects of their doctrine on SOE experiences. Soviet Special Operations units examined, captured SOE equipment, and adapted concepts for their own use. Even the Germans, rebuilding their military in the 1950s, incorporated lessons learned from defending against SOE operations into their security doctrines. The explosive rats themselves lived on primarily as historical curiosities. The few surviving specimens became museum pieces. Historians researching SOE operations discovered them in archives and private collections. Each rediscovery generated new interest in the program. Articles were written, documentaries produced. The rats achieved a fame in historical memory that far exceeded their actual operational impact. They became symbolic of SOE's creative approach to warfare, evidence that British ingenuity extended even into the macabre realm of weaponized rodent carcasses. Fraser Smith died in November 1992 at his farm in Devon. He had spent his post-war years writing about his experiences and maintaining connections with former SOE personnel. His books provided valuable historical records, though they sometimes embellished or simplified complex operations for readability. The core truth remained. He had designed equipment that helped win the war. His inventions had saved lives. His work had contributed to Germany's defeat in ways both measurable and immeasurable. The story of the explosive rats ultimately transcends its specific details. It represents a moment when military necessity drove innovation in unexpected directions, when the conventional wisdom about warfare expanded to include psychological operations that achieved effects through uncertainty rather than destruction. When 100 dead rodents, stuffed with green plastic, explosive and captured before deployment, became more valuable than any successful sabotage mission could have been. In warfare, as in life, perception often matters more than reality. The Germans believed in the explosive rats. They trained their personnel to watch for them. They expended resources guarding against them, and in doing so, they validated British strategy more effectively than any actual explosion could have achieved. The rats never detonated. They didn't need to. Their very existence, known to the enemy but not deployable by the British, created exactly the outcome the Special Operations Executive had sought all along. Disruption, uncertainty, fear, the invisible cost of occupation made slightly more expensive. And in total war, where every advantage matters and every inefficiency multiplies, even dead rats could help win the struggle for civilization's survival. This was their purpose, this was their achievement, and this remains their testimony to the strange genius of irregular warfare, conducted by desperate people in desperate times, who discovered that sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones that never fire a shot. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.